Folks, we get to take an exciting step in this lesson as we begin to talk about DOM and a little bit later, jQuery. So first of all, DOM, that stands for Document Object Model. And to some extent, you've already been using this as you use the inspector to browse around and look at elements on your page. And you kind of see them in a tree form where there are child elements and parent elements and things like this. So what is this, or why DOM? Well, the DOM provides a standard way of working with content of an HTML page, seeing things in that tree structure and being able to work with elements in a consistent way is kind of what we're talking about here. We can use the DOM to select and read element content and attributes. We can use the DOM to manipulate elements, that's modify, insert, remove, etc. And we can use DOM to traverse a document using sibling, parent, and child relationships. So in this lesson, we'll be covering these first three bullets, particularly 2 and 3. And in the next lesson, we'll look at how to traverse documents with DOM. So the DOM is cool, but it really becomes cool when we look at how we can use jQuery to access it. So for the record, your book contains plenty of examples of sort of vanilla JavaScript approaches to working with DOM. But it also includes examples of how to do those same things with jQuery. So you'll find in the readings that I've given you that I'm typically skipping the ones that are done with vanilla JavaScript, mostly because I don't want you to have to learn two different things. I want to get to the quick and easy way in this course, which is all about exposing you to these concepts. There's plenty of time, should you find that you really enjoy this, to sort of step back and learn more about the vanilla JavaScript approach, because there are some benefits to knowing how to do things with plain old JavaScript. But jQuery is so common, and it is so easy, that I figured this is a better way to expose you to these ideas than to give you extra steps. So, you like that? All right, we'll hope that works for you. So here we go, jQuery basics for working with the DOM. So first of all, jQuery itself is a library that we're going to stack on top of vanilla JavaScript. It's sort of an extension or a whole package of extra things that make things easy and helpful, and of course you've been using this already to some extent. We're now formally introducing for you how to link in a jQuery library. So you can download the source code from jQuery.com/download, save it into a local file, and then link that in. Or you can link straight to it using a public repository, such as the Google hosted libraries. You just search for jQuery hosted library in your browser and use this provided script tag for the latest version of jQuery. We will do some examples of this in just a moment. But assuming we've got jQuery linked in and connected to our page, we can then do some very basic things with jQuery. One of those is the DRE that you've seen in place, the Document Ready Event Handler, that allows us to ensure that the code we place on the page doesn't actually get called or doesn't actually process until the whole page has loaded. We will talk more about this later when we work with events in a few more lessons. But here we want to hone in and talk about how we select things with jQuery and therefore introduce the jQuery object itself. So basically, the jQuery library and all of its functionality is stored in a variable that is the $sign variable. So whenever you see a $sign and then some action, particularly like what you see here, $sign parentheses, what we're actually doing is calling the jQuery library and then doing some basic functions inside of it. Now we will also get in the habit of naming our own variables with a $sign at the beginning to help remind ourselves and anybody else looking at the code that that variable will hold a jQuery object. But anyhow, all that to say, $sign in this course should be a big flag for you that jQuery is being used. So we use this syntax to select an element and convert it to a jQuery object. We have the $sign followed by a pair of parentheses, and inside of that parentheses we have the placeholder here, which we can provide any number of different things. Typically, we're going to be providing a CSS style selector for some element on the page that's going to be passed in as a string. And here are 3 examples. In the first, we're selecting all of the list items on the page. So if you wanted to select and style all list items, you would just enter li in your CSS sheet, right? Well, when we want to select all LIs to do something with them using jQuery, we use this $, parentheses, and then in quotes, because this is a string, the li selector. Same thing for the next line down. Can you recognize what that selector would be? That would be for hyperlinks inside of something with an ID of navmain, or just navmain A. And the third one would be for something that has a class of active. So this is going to do the very same thing in terms of the concept that CSS does. It's going to select each of the things we've specified here. Now, with CSS, we then provide some properties to modify the way that those elements would appear. But with JavaScript, or here with jQuery, we're usually going to jump in and either manipulate the content of that element or use it as a starting point to traverse around the page, or listen for events on it, like listen for a click on that navmain A. Boy, there's all kinds of things we do with this, but the most essential fundamental thing is being able to select an item with jQuery. So before we move on, let's go practice getting jQuery installed on our page and doing some basic selections. So if you pull up the Lesson 5 demo file that I've linked into Moodle, you'll find this sheet. Let's take a peek at what it's looking like. Example file, dom. Okay, and we've got some stuff going on over here that's just Bootstrap styles. Bootstrap styles are being linked in up here thanks to Bootswatch. Okay, so on this first screen it says that we need to, oh yeah, so here we go. Let's preview what's already here in the DOM. All right, and if we switch to elements here, what we're looking at is essentially one representation of the DOM. All right, so there we go. Now, before we can work, we need to add in jQuery. So what I usually do is I go and I Google hosted libraries. It's a funny thing to Google, right? Yeah, so, and then this first link usually is the one we want. And over on the right, one of the options is jQuery. And under jQuery, be very careful that you don't go to jQuery Mobile or jQuery UI, just plain old jQuery. We usually can grab the 3x snippet just fine. So we've copied that. We're now going back to Codio and pasting this. We usually put this at the very bottom of the body tag, above any other, above the closing body tag, but basically after the whole document. Okay. Now, in order to work with JavaScript, of course, we have to have either a separate script attached, or we can put our script in here. But basically, now that we have that we have this library linked in, we can now add the DRE and keep moving forward. So there's many ways of doing the DRE. This is one of them that's the most succinct. And we're going to add a script to test what we're doing. All right, we'll just go refresh, check the console, and there's our message. So we've confirmed that we've loaded jQuery in just fine. So for example, if we had not been successful at this, we would see this message: uncaught reference $sign is not defined. That message means you did not successfully load jQuery. And you can see the previous line says, oh, we had an error getting from this address. It's because I broke the path, guys. Okay, I'm fixing the path. And we've put that in. Okay, now jQuery is working fine. All right, I usually do this just to make sure before I get in too far that I've got everything working the way it needs to be. All right, now we can move on to the new stuff, that is formally working with jQuery to select things. So if we wanted to select the H1, we would do what? The jQuery selector. And inside the selector, we would put a string and the appropriate CSS selector for that thing. All right, so there it is. $, and then in quotes, inside parentheses, H1. So we could console log this. Same thing. So you see that's the same thing. Just here, I just selected. I never did anything more with it. But down here, as I have selected, I'm actually logging it. So we'll actually go see what that looks like. So this is what you're going to get used to seeing when you have selected a jQuery element. It's going to have this bracket syntax because it's actually kind of an array. A jQuery object is an array. And inside of that, there is an item that is the actual selection. That's the actual raw vanilla JavaScript DOM element. Okay, and then there are other properties here that come from the way that jQuery is set up. So this is all like jQuery stuffs going on in here. Okay, so the other thing we often might do is actually assign this to a variable. So the h1 is assigned the jQuery selector h1. So that's just a normal variable, right? Now we don't have to select it down here. If we wanted to work with it, we can just say console log h1. So there you see the very same thing. We've selected that h1 element and we're seeing its contents. Now the one other thing that's the convention is to name these variables with a $sign at the beginning. Okay, we're not actually, this is not actually the jQuery object directly. That $sign alone is the jQuery object. But when we're storing a jQuery selection or some other jQuery thing in a variable, the convention is to intentionally name that variable with a $sign up front, so that we kind of remind ourselves, this guy, he has actual jQuery in it. Okay, so then we just change the console log, and the result is exactly the same. It's just a name. And what's in a name, right? All right, so let's work the next example. We're going to select a P, paragraph, that is. Just like that. That would select a paragraph. All right, next one prompts us to select a class of Jumbotron. So pretty easy. Just select a class of Jumbotron. Now, not Jumpotron, just Jumbotron. Next one, I want you to try on your own, and then come back once you've given it a shot. We want to select paragraphs inside Jumbotron. So, according to our normal process, that means Jumbotron has to come first, followed by a space, followed by P for paragraphs inside Jumbotron. This is just basic CSS selectors, right? So count this as a CSS review. And the last one, list group item, no big deal there. All right, so we have accomplished each of those, but we've not done anything with them. That's just fine. We have simply selected them to practice doing selections. All right, so now doing selections is great, but what do we want to actually do once we've selected things? Well, once we've selected them, we usually want to read their content and attributes and store those things in a variable. So in the first three bullets here on the left, we have all the same ideas happening. On the first example, we're creating a variable and assigning to it the jQuery selection of something, and then we're going into that something and retrieving its text content. In the second bullet, we're doing the very same thing, except we're not retrieving the text content, we're retrieving its full HTML content. And the last one, we're doing something very similar. We're now retrieving an attribute. So notice that in all three, we're assigning them to a variable. That's not required, but it's pretty normal. Why else would we retrieve text if we didn't want to store it and do something with it? In all three, we are selecting something, a string, or we're selecting something using a CSS selector as a string. And in the third one only, we have this third pattern object or placeholder to pass in, and that is to name the actual attribute that we want to select. So you can see the example on the far right there is that we're declaring the variable logo href, and we're assigning to it the jQuery selection for the thing with an ID of logo, and we're getting its href attribute. All right, see the pattern? Good. Let's go give these three options a try in our code. So I'm going to wipe out the stuff from the first series here. We don't need those anymore. So if we want to retrieve the plain text content of h1, well, where we're going to go with that, we're first going to have to select the h1, right? Then we're going to call the .text method. So we've selected an h1 and we've called out its text. Now, notice that what actually we're going to get if we console log this is not a jQuery object. Because we have gone further and actually grabbed the text content, you see, example file 1, we actually just have a string now. So when we decide we want to assign this to a variable so that we can do something with it later, we do not have to use the $ up front. So we could just say h1 text or something like that. So logging h1 text, and there we have just that string content. So if we did something fancy like the h1 says h1 text, see, we just concatenated a string around this, and we just have the string content in the middle. All right, so we just got a little bit fancy. Nothing crazy going on there. But bottom line is that we moved beyond the jQuery object, and we grabbed a specific piece of content from it that actually turned out to be just a string. All right, so there's another process that we could have done with this same thing. We could have said var h1 is assigned the h1. Now notice that now we really are storing the jQuery object itself in the variable, so I use the $ up front in the name of the variable to remind ourselves, hey, we've got a jQuery object here. So now we can still go right to that jQuery object and call its text property. So notice that what's stored in h1 $ is this guy. So if you kind of imagine this being right here, it's the very same thing we just did, right? So there are times where you might want to do many things with one element, like with the h1. At this point, we've grabbed it, and now we've retrieved its text value. But later, we might want to do something else with it. So having the h1 stored in a variable could be handy. At the end of the day, this is the most direct way to get to that property and to store it. We've just selected the h1 and dived into it and grabbed its text content, and then we've kind of discarded the h1 and just stored that text in a variable. So let's quickly run through the rest of these. Number 2 would be something like this. Info text is assigned jQuery selector id info dot text. Now, number 3, we switch and we don't want the text content anymore. We want the actual HTML content. So let's take a peek at what that looks like. Yeah, so var1 HTML or h1 HTML, we're going to select the h1, but now we're going to get the HTML content. So let's console log that and see what that gives us. Got to actually name the variable correctly, though. Okay. Yeah, now, nothing fancy here, right? So that's because there's nothing but plain text content inside of h1. So in this case, h1 text and h1 HTML are the very same thing. But let's see what happens when we get the info HTML. So I just duplicated that line so that I can use the good parts that I already want. Console log HTML, oops, info HTML. All right, so in this case, let's see. So let's see. Let me do this in a methodical way. I'm going to tell our first h1 text to be logged, and I'm going to tell our info text to be logged. Okay, so but before we go check the results, let's think about this. So when we select h1 and get its text content, that is what we're dealing with right there. When we select h1 and get its HTML contents, we're getting something slightly different in terms of scope, but the answer is not really obvious. But it becomes a little more obvious if we consider the content of info. So if we select info and get its text content, what we're actually going to return, or what we're actually going to see, is all of the text values that are inside of this thing. So if I just comment out my console log for the HTML of this, you can see, look, that we've got each of the little bits of text with no markup around it. Now, why you would ever want that? Well, you never know. Someday you might, so just tuck that away. But more likely, the case is that you're actually going to want that markup along with the content. So you can see now the difference. With the H1, there wasn't anything but plain text. So we just have plain text in both situations. But with the info div, there's a whole lot more there. So we got all the plain text with just text, or we got all of the text plus the markup around it with the HTML call. All right, last of all, let's read some variable attributes. So we might have the ID jumbo ID. So first we're going to select the thing with a class of Jumbotron, and then we're going to read its attribute. Which one? The ID attribute. Okay, so Jumbotron up here, there's the thing with a class of Jumbotron, and it has an ID of masthead. So if we log this, we should see the string masthead. All right, because that's the value of the Jumbotron's ID attribute. Let's make use of some code and do the next one. We want the class attribute of the main tag. So this is going to be called the main class. And main is just a tag, so just main. And which attribute? The class attribute. So just copying and pasting to save time. So now we're console logging main class. Well, what is the class on the main tag? Well, let's see. Here's main. Oh, look, it has a class of row. So we should see row. Let's do something that has a more interesting class, such as this guy here, ID shopping list. His class is shopping list space call-sm-6. So if I just change this just for proving the point, shopping list. Is that what it was? Yep, shopping list. And we echo that class, or console log that class. Boy, PHP coming out. Look, there is the actual class attribute on that thing. Okay, so we can read text, plain text. We can read HTML content, and we can read attribute values. All really cool stuff. So reading is pretty cool, but chances are we don't want to just read. We want to do something with that. We want to modify it, or we want to store it and change it somewhere else or do something with it. So let's talk about how we would actually modify those values themselves. So you can use the same three methods to modify HTML content and attributes. So the same three that we just covered. So you can see on these two slides we have the text method and the HTML method to modify text content and HTML content respectively. And in both of these situations we're going to, again, select something. So the first placeholder there is for the CSS selector for the thing we want to select. Then we call the appropriate method text or HTML. But notice that before, with text and HTML, when we wanted to read the values, we would just have an empty parenthesis set. When we want to change the content, we can now put a value into those parentheses, usually in string form, so as to actually modify the content of that thing. So you can see here we've selected something with an ID of status, and we've changed its text value to your order is saved. Okay, so that is the best, simplest, cleanest way to do this when you want to remove the existing text content, and really all content, and replace it with some plain text. But if you want to replace with actual rich HTML text, then you need to use the HTML method, as you see here. So in the example at the bottom of this page, select the thing with an ID of status and modify its HTML content to contain, in emphasis, congratulations. And then your order is saved. So you can see we've passed that whole thing in as a string. We've just put the markup, the emphasis tag, around some content. It's all just there inside of the string. It's all just characters. It's just a bracket, and then M, and then a closing bracket, and then congratulations, exclamation point. Those are all just pieces of symbols and text, right? It's the browser that recognizes that's actual markup and renders it as emphasis. Okay, so when we want to modify plain text or HTML text, we just pass in the desired value to the parentheses that we have from earlier. Now with attributes, we're going to do something very similar, but because we already had used the first parameter in the attribute to specify which attribute we wanted to modify, we now add a second parameter that contains the new value we want for that attribute. So in this example, we've selected something with an ID of user email, and we've selected its class attribute, and we've modified that class attribute to be invalid, as in contain the string invalid. So it's getting a class of invalid. All right, let's go work some examples. Okay, so first of all, we want to select the P in Jumbotron and change its plain text value. So let's get a sense of what we have there. Here's Jumbotron, and here's the P tag, dom, da-dom, dom. Okay, so we're going to select that and make it something else. So first we have to select it. Jumbotron P, right? That's this thing we selected, and I spelled everything correctly. Now we want to modify its plain text value, so we're going to call text. Now, just as is, we're only reading the content. We're only retrieving it. But if we pass something inside here, we would now be changing it. So let's see, what else could we put in there? I like cookies. Okay, so here, where dom da dom dom is right now, when we refresh, it's changed to I like cookies. Now look at that. You just changed the content beyond what is written in the markup. How do you feel about that? Well, here's something to note. Browsers have gotten better and better at this, so I hope that raises a little bit of concern to you, by the way. The idea of coming alongside our finely crafted markup and changing it with JavaScript, that's understandably concerning. But notice that what actually happens here is the DOM itself is updated. When we switch over to look at the element, that new value is now here on the page. So if we have somebody reading this page with a screen reader, if they had read this element already, they would never know that that content had changed. But if they haven't gotten to it yet, if our script processes before they get to this element, then they'll just read the new contents of the DOM. Now the source file is not changed. The source file stays the same. But your computer, your browser, or that person using a screen reader, their browser, is modifying that document structure on the fly, thanks to your JavaScript. Okay, let's do another example. Select the well and place a paragraph inside of it with text as you see fit. So where's the well? Here it is. So there's nothing in the well right now. So let's put something in the well. So we're going to select the well. And because we're going to want to put a paragraph inside of it, we now want to use the HTML method to pass in a string that contains a well-formed paragraph. So what are we going to put in the well? Let's put the bucket. The bucket goes in the well. And let's get a little bit fancy and add a little bit more markup there. Notice that we're putting the bucket in the well. All right. So where's the well? It's down here. The bucket goes in the well. We look at the DOM. The DOM is modified. There it is. The bucket goes in the well. And nothing happened in the console. All right, now last of all, let's modify an attribute. Select the first paragraph inside info and set its class attribute to lead. Now, I've given you a little trick here. Let's see if you can decipher or fix it as you practice on your own. When you're ready, come back and watch my solution. So here we go. We're going to select the thing with an ID of info, and we're going to modify its attribute. Which attribute? The class attribute. What's the new value? Well, we want it to have a class of lead. So if I do exactly what the instruction says, as is, I might have thought to do that, right? But watch what happens. Let's go to that element. Actually, what should it be? It should be the info. Oops, sorry, we want the first paragraph inside, so first child. That's the first paragraph inside of the info block, which is this guy right here, right under the H2, right? There's the info, and there's the first. So P first child isn't going to work. We want first of type. That's a plain old CSS selector, might not know it, but that is one that gets the first instance of that tag inside of this context. Okay, so that is the thing we have obtained. If I right-click on it, look what happened. Period lead is what was placed in there. Aha! So period lead might be how we would select this thing, because when we select classes, we use a period to represent the class. But we don't want it to actually have the period there in the value. So the catch there, whenever you're modifying classes and whatnot, is to remember that we might be used to seeing a period here, but it's going to be a little bit of a gotcha if we leave that period in down here. And now when we refresh, we should actually see this change, because the lead class is something that is part of the Bootstrap system. Kind of change that font to be large and kind of fun. Okay. So there we have examples of actually modifying elements. Feel free to play around with this to get the idea even more if you'd like. Okay, now you might have thought to yourself, boy, that class selector is pretty handy. Maybe I'm going to use that a lot. Well, if that didn't occur to you, let me tell you, it's very handy, and you're going to use it a lot. Because we have a lot of power to select things by classes with CSS and style them. In fact, a ton of what we do in terms of changing the appearance of things on the page can be accomplished simply by using CSS selectors to provide styles for classes, and then using JavaScript to just switch out those classes on elements. So jQuery thought of this, or actually they knew this, because this was, by the time jQuery came around, a lot of people were doing CSS changes with classes, and they thought, you know what, let's make this easier. Instead of having to call the attribute class all the time, let's just deal with the fact that people are going to want to work with classes. So we have a couple of shorthand things that deal with classes. We can add a certain class by selecting an element, then calling add class, and providing the class that we want added onto that element. Notice that this is going to stack it onto any existing classes. It's not going to erase any of the classes that are already on an element. It's going to stack a new class onto it. So that's also really nice. So, well, maybe you want to pull an element, a class off of an element. So we have the remove class method to do the same thing. So we select an element, we call .remove class, we pass in the class that we want to be removed. And you can see examples of both of those on the page here. We have more. If we want to figure out whether a class is on, and if it is, take it off. Or if it isn't, put it on, basically toggling the class, we can call toggle class. And last of all, we can also check to see if a particular class is on, but not change it in any way, but just to check to see if it's on. And we would call the has class. Now note that in this one, this last example, notice the ones leading up to this, we're selecting element and modifying it. So we haven't been storing these operations in variables. But with this one, we are going to get a value back from this. If the element has that class, we're going to get true back. And if it does not have this class, we're going to get false back. So likely we want to store either one in a variable. So the variable is invalid is assigned the result of the operation of selecting the thing with an ID of user email and the test of whether it has a class of invalid. So if that's true, if it does have that class of invalid, we'll have true in the variable is invalid. And if it does not have the class of invalid, then the value of false will be stored in is invalid. Okay, so let's go test out these class shorthand methods. Let's select the thing with shopping list and add the class of panel to it. So first let's just kind of find it and get a sense. Whoa, there's a whole lot already on there. It has a shopping list class and a call SM6 class. So we're going to select the ID shopping list and we're going to add the class of panel to it. So we should see that new class add onto there as a third class. So we select shopping list. Then we're going to add class. Which class? Panel. Now again, remember we're not putting dot panel in here because that would literally put dot panel on, and that's not what we do when we're actually naming a class on something. We don't put the dot in there. Alright, so let's do that. Let's go save and refresh. Alright, so down here, shopping list just got the class of panel. See, it's on there, and it is stacked on the end, as opposed to being slid earlier. Now, what effect did that have? If we don't have the class of panel on there, notice that it does not have that border and background around it. So, hey, you know, kind of adding that border and background adds some kind of emphasis or focus. So, hey, maybe when they clicked on, you know, this area over here or something like that, we want to draw attention by making it a panel and kind of making it pop out. Okay, so we would have kind of used JavaScript to add that panel around it. Cool. Cool, cool, cool. Let's practice a few more. Select the first list group item and remove the class active from it. So, whoa, what are we talking about? So let's see. Aha, the first list group item, because there are several list group items here. If we select the first one, we could do dot list group item dot first child. Okay, so dot first or list group item colon first child. Okay, and then we want to remove class of active. All right, so that's got the active class on it. So we're going to say, hey, I don't want that anymore. Take that off. So watch that before we refresh, it's got the blue highlight on it because we have some CSS that says when something has a class of active on it, it's got that blue highlight around it. But now if we refresh, we have used JavaScript to pull that off. There is no more active class on that item. All right, in the last one now, we're going to actually move that active class onto something else. So let's select the second list group item and toggle its class of active. Okay, so we're going to go list group item. Now the second item we could do nth child 2. That allows us to get the second child. And now this time we're going to do toggle class. So we could do add class, but which would accomplish the same goal as this does right now, in that there is no active class on the second item. So if we say toggle class and there is no such class, well, that is going to effectively turn on that class. So toggle class active. So now notice that the selected class has moved, or that this one appears to be the selected one, where the first one used to be, because we have toggled that class on. So watch what happens if I put this very same line a second time. The first time on this line right here, there was no active class, and so it toggled on. But now when we do it a second time, programmatically, it has that class now. So when we say toggle class, it should turn it back off, and so we should not see the selection anymore. Okay, so that's toggle class for you. All right, a few more things to go, and we're almost done here. Yep, so now we want to move on to talking about replacing and removing content. And it assumes, just so I didn't have to enter it each time, that we're working with some selected thing here. So you're going to assume that before each of these periods, we're going to have a jQuery selector. So select something and then call replace with, and then you pass in what you want to be replaced. So this is going to replace the entire selected element with the string provided, regardless of what that is. So if we select the image with a class of profile and we replace it with a paragraph that says the image is not available, well, we have effectively now pulled that image out of the DOM and put a paragraph in its place. Or we could call remove. this pulls the entire element off of the page. So we've selected something and we've called remove. All we've done is just pull it out. We haven't replaced it, we've just removed it. So there are times where you want to replace, pull an item out and replace it with something. And there are times where you just want to plain pull it out. And then last of all, we can also remove a particular attribute. So in this case, we've selected the image with the class of profile and we've removed its alt attribute. Why in the world we would do that, I do not know. All right, so let's go take a peek and practice with each of these things. I'm going to clean this up a little bit just to give some room. We're going to restore things back to kind of a normal state here. So now we want to remove the last paragraph from inside of the info div. So we're going to want to select that first by going to info and then p last of type. That gives us the last paragraph inside of info. And then we can go remove. All right, because we weren't told to replace it with anything. We just needed to remove it. So the paragraph that begins morbi quam sapien should not be there. So you see morbi quam sapien is there. See a bunch change up. And so indeed that third paragraph has been removed. Only 2 paragraphs there now. All right, in the next one we want to replace the first grocery list item with the text beef. Now, we weren't told to put it in a list item, but I'm going to assume that we actually want to put it in a list item. So if we took it literally, we might go like this. Replace the first grocery item with beef. So that's going to be shopping list li first child. Many ways you could select this. That's just one. So I've selected by the parent and then the li that is the first child. Okay? And I'm going to say replace with beef. So I just took it literally and I have pulled out the li and replaced it with a string beef. So it shouldn't have any formatting. It's kind of ugly, right? Because I just went inside there, I pulled that li off and I put a beef element. That's no fun. So let's actually put an li. Now it's actually a list item, but it doesn't look like the other items in that list because those other items have some special stuff on them. They had some other cool classes. So this is a case where if we really wanted to match this, it might have been better. And we weren't evaluating better. We were just practicing with replace with. What we might have actually wanted to do is just change its text content to be beef. So rather than replace it. So this is where I'll tell you, I don't do a lot of replace with. I find that more often what I'm wanting to do is just change the content of that thing. So there, I just changed it to beef. Okay, but you saw how to do replace with. And now let's add a new item. Okay, this goes with the next couple slides. So let's switch back and finish out the slides. But you've seen the idea with these two. So last of all, we have talked about selecting things. We've talked about modifying their content. We've talked about replacing their content. We talked about the class shorthands a little bit before that. Last of all, if we want to just plain add something new somewhere, we've got 4 different options. And of course, we're assuming that we're selecting something for each of these. But we can do before or after, and we can do prepend or append. And I'll encourage you to look at page 318 of your text. Hopefully you have a page numbered text for that. But that page gives a nice little visual example. I'll run through it too, just in case you don't have that. So what we have here is this idea. If we select the list group and we say we want to put content before it, we would be putting content right here. Actually physically before the item. Okay, so we've selected the UL, we say before, we're going to actually physically insert it right above that element in the DOM. The inverse is true with after. After would go physically at the end, so outside of the closing tag at the very end. Prepend and append allow us to go inside the item, either at the beginning with prepend, or after the very last item with append. And you know, there's different cases where you want different things. If you want to add a new item to a list, you know, there are times where you want to put that new item at the top of the list. There are times when you want to put that new item at the bottom of the list. There are also times where you want to say after the list altogether, you know, display a message about the list or put a label over the list or things like that. See, there's all kinds of different times when we might want to do this. So let's practice with them. In number 3, it says add a new item to the end of the grocery list as you see fit. So I'm going to assume then that we want a new item at the end of the list, as in a new li down there. So let's go. We would select class of list group, and now we're going to do append because we're going to put something at the very end. And now we're going to want to put an li. And we're going to go ahead and match all the attributes on this class of list group item. Notice that I used single quotes to wrap this class attribute since I have double quotes wrapped around my whole string. That's a way to kind of avoid accidentally terminating your string and ending up with an error. And let's say we want cookies. Come on, give me some cookies. And there you see we've added that item at the end of the list. Every grocery list needs cookies on it. Now add a new paragraph after the grocery list as you see fit. So in this case we want to go down here and put a new paragraph after the list. So you know what, I just said a pretty nice little paragraph. Let's make use of some copy paste. Let's put a paragraph that says every grocery list needs cookies on it. And there you go. A paragraph was added after the list altogether using the after. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Hopefully you caught that. I used, since I copy pasted, I didn't change this. I just did append and I should have done after. So watch the difference. Spacing makes a difference, doesn't it? So we right click and inspect. We see there it is, that paragraph. It is after the list group and our goal is accomplished. So there you have a thorough introduction to all kinds of things that we can do with the DOM thanks to jQuery. Have fun in the exercise.